Carter. I'm making another climate emergency video. This is a video message, and it is an appeal. It is increasingly a desperate appeal. And I'd have to ask, are we really willing to leave behind, for all the world's children and all future generations, a poisoned planet? Are we really willing to leave them a literal hell on earth, a planet not worth living on? Because that is definitely what is happening today. I'm making this video in May 2019. I've been following the climate, ocean, atmospheric greenhouse gas pollution science intensely for the past 10 years. Ever since James Hansen made the public statement that we were indeed in a state of planetary emergency, and that was 10 years ago. Everything, of course, has gotten rapidly worse. I've been communicating the science, the data and the data sets, presenting them to the international conferences, and for the past several years, all of these data sets, all of these adverse indicators and direct effects of atmospheric greenhouse gas pollution have been getting worse, and they've been getting worse faster. Today they're all accelerating. This is absolutely insane. It's insanely evil is what it is, because we are apparently allowing the power of money, the corporate investment banks that are financing the enormous fossil fuel extraction and distribution products, and the so-called political leaders that are supporting this planetary destructive activity. This video is about the 2020 deadline. It is a true deadline because after wasting time since 1990, since the first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the first IPCC assessment, all that has happened is that precious time has been wasted. Action has been delayed and delayed and delayed. There's absolutely no more time now. And this is abundantly clear from the accelerating data sets. We are more than out of time. In this video, I present the scientific evidence from the computer projections. I've chosen a variety of sources going back over many years to most recently that proves that 2020 has always been the very latest, the absolute latest, that we have to put global greenhouse gas emissions into rapid decline. And we've known for years and years and years that this can readily be done. The IPCC, several years ago, they did a special report on renewable energy. And at the very start of the report, they said that we have more than enough renewable energy to replace all the fossil fuel energy that the world needs by far. And this has been confirmed, of course, over and over again. So I'll be going through again these many graphs, and I hope that you'll bear with me and watch them, and I hope that you're going to be impressed that the evidence is totally overwhelming. That global emissions must decline immediately. So here we go. This is the home page of the Climate Emergency Institute, presently to project and communicate the 2020 deadline. The fact of the matter is we have no time left. By that I mean we only have 1 year left to put global emissions into rapid decline from 2020 to possibly, only possibly, avoid runaway global heating and global climate chaos and global oceans collapse. We've got 12 years left. That's somewhat of a misunderstanding. The IPCC 1.5 degrees C report made it very clear that emissions have to decline by, in the report, 45% by 2030, dating from 2010. Now I have, as you can see, I have the 2020 multiple graphs presentation, and previous to that I had put together an update of the Earth emergency data trends. So this is just a quick reminder that all of the adverse impacts, indicators, and direct effects that have been monitored over the years, they're all getting worse, and they're getting worse faster. All of these adverse indicators are in fact now accelerating, and that's pretty obvious if you cast your eye over all those graphs there. So this image, these data sets, these trends, they scream at us. Global emissions must be put into decline on an immediate basis. So now we're looking at the topic of this video, which is the 2020 deadline for global emissions to go into decline, and to decline rapidly at the very, very latest. So you'll see, as I said in the introduction, I've chosen a wide variety of sources, and I've also covered a long period of time going back over the past years of all of these reports. They're all projections. You should be able to pretty well immediately see that they all say the same thing, which is that global emissions have to decline from 2020 at the very, very latest. Well, I should say to start off with that you'll see that 2020 applies to both 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C. The graphics from the published science I've adapted for simplicity, but all the text that I have on the images, all the text that I have on the images are as published. The red arrows, they all indicate 2020, and you'll notice that some of these projections have emissions declining before 2020. CO2e or EQ, that's CO2 equivalent, and that includes the other greenhouse gases along with carbon dioxide, notably methane and nitrous oxide. So these first two here, they're from the 1.5 degrees C report, most recent report, 2018. And SPM means summary for policymakers, and that's important because it means that this particular science has been scrutinized and approved by all the world governments. So there are two representations here from the 1.5C SPM. This is a stylized version of global CO2 1.5 degrees C report addressed carbon dioxide. Global CO2 emissions pathways up here, so higher emissions on the vertical in billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. And you'll see that CO2 emissions decline from 2020, and they decline rapidly. IPCC on this image has two projections. This one for zero emissions by 2055, and this one more rapid emissions zeroed at 2040. Obviously, the IPCC is implying that we could and should go for the 2040 zero. This one here, this is the best case scenario in the 1.5 degrees C assessment called P1. Gray is the fossil fuel, so that's fossil fuel CO2 emissions, and the land, the smaller area here, is CO2 emissions from land, notably deforestation, of course. Emissions in gigatons of CO2 per year again, 2020. The IPCC anticipated that emissions would continue to increase as they have done, and at 2020, so on an immediate basis, you see emissions have to go into decline, and they have to decline rapidly, and they have to be zeroed by 2050. This graph here is from the last full assessment of the IPCC, the 2014 fifth assessment. This is the best case scenario of that assessment. It was called RCP 2.6. This scenario is the only one that does not go above 2 degrees C by 2100. And that requires, again, global emissions to go into decline by or from 2020. There's a slower decline here up to the end of the century because this was a projection of 2 degrees C and only 2 degrees C by 2100, which would be much higher than 2 degrees C after 2100. So fortunately, the 2 degrees C target has been rejected by the science now, and we're all agreed that we have to aim and give everything that we've got for the 1.5 degree C limit. This is the 2007 IPCC fourth assessment. Again, annual emissions. This is the best case scenario of the fourth assessment. It was called Category 1. And this is defined by stabilization levels. This is an atmospheric stabilization of 445 to 499, 445 to 499 ppm of CO2 equivalent. Today, or rather last year, 2018, we were already at 496 ppm CO2 equivalent from NOAA's annual greenhouse gas index. Now this is a 2 degrees C equilibrium warming limit. So this is a different target to the more recent 2014. This is a full long-term limit on 2 degrees C going way past 2100. You'll see the same thing, that emissions are declining fairly rapidly from 2020, and they're actually declining from 2015. So I remember very well and was impressed by the lead authors of the IPCC fourth assessment, who all stressed that action must be started now, and all stressed that global emissions, had to be, as they say, reversed by 2015. And that was totally true. Same thing applies. We have no time left. We're really into negative time. And I want to stress again, when I talk about no time left, I'm talking about our survival. I'm talking about the survival of humanity, of the human race, and most life on this planet, in fact, almost all life on this planet, as the United Nations Director General, Antonio Guterres, has been warning us over the past 12 or 18 months. And I greatly respect his efforts for that. This, we finished with the IPCC now. We've covered those assessments and reports. This is the global carbon budget, which is put out every year by the Global Carbon Project. This is the last one, December of 2018. This is fossil fuel CO2 emissions, and it runs from 1980 up to 2060 here. you'll see that there was a flattening of the emissions increase from 2014 to 2015, but in 2017, global CO2 fossil fuel emissions increased, and they increased again by a large amount, nearly 3% in 2018. So that line there is the worst case scenario. So you can see that we're tracking very, very close now to the worst case emissions scenario. By that I mean the worst case that the scientists thought would be plausible. And here we are on it. It's a suicide, a global suicide scenario. This one here, this is a rather different scientific assessment report. This was published in March of this year in the Earth's Future Journal. And what this tries to do is to reckon what our emissions could follow based on the absolutely best prospects for the national emissions targets. The national emissions targets, you'll see shortly, are paltry, they're deplorable, and they're a death sentence, a global death sentence. So this report does that, and it divides the emissions up into what is most likely for the various regions, the United States, the EU, China, India, and then the rest of the world. Now, there's 2020, so you see that emissions are declining before 2020. And this assessment is for the 2 degrees C limit, only by 2100, and only a 66% chance of limiting to 2 degrees C. So this is a good impression of the absolute suicidal insanity of what. This is similar to the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report, the P1 best case scenario. This is very good. It's by Climate Analytics, which is a consulting group of world climate experts. And they've elaborated and helped to improve somewhat the 1.5 degrees C report by including all of the greenhouse gases as well as CO2 emissions. The IPCC 1.5 focused only on carbon dioxide emissions. By 2020, all greenhouse gas emissions peak, and all greenhouse gases go into a rapid decline. CO2 emissions, of course, peak and go into a rapid decline from 2020. By 2030, all greenhouse gas emissions have declined by 40%, have declined fast to a decline of 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. So that's the same 50% half reduction of global greenhouse gas as well as CO2 emissions by 2030. It's pretty obvious that we can only do this if emissions start going into decline right away. How else are we going to cut emissions by 50% by 2030? So the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report was absolutely right. And yeah, it did shock the world somewhat. CO2 emissions here reach net zero by 2050, as in the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report. Here's just another source. This is the New Climate Institute, and this is this year, February 2019. You see the same thing. Emissions decline rapidly from 2020. This is still projecting for the 2 degrees C as well as the 1.5 degrees C. As I say, we're all agreed that the only sane and rational target is 1.5 degrees C. Tough though it's going to be. This is another image. This is an infographic from the Global Carbon Project that we had a look at up there. And it's very useful, good infographic. It was published last year, 2018 again. On the top here, there are emissions, and this is fossil fuel CO2 emissions. And then below, there's the global temperature change. So you'll see, and it goes from 1850, 2018 to the end of the century. And here is 2 degrees C there, and here is 1.5 degrees C under 1.5 degrees C. So this infographic anticipates that we can stabilize the temperature at 1.5 degrees C and to get below it. This requires substantial removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the air. And this shows up here in the emissions. This is the 1.5 degrees C, and you see it goes below zero. And this is 2 degrees C there. It says zero here, and the text says emissions need to rapidly decrease to zero to limit climate change and its impacts. So we have to get to zero pretty fast. And even then, we have to develop the capacity to remove some carbon dioxide. We have no capacity for that whatsoever at the moment. We know it's theoretically possible. We're moving on to the next one here. This is from Climate Action Tracker. This is also a group of climate experts, and they do the very valuable job for us of analyzing where we are headed with emissions. That is with the plans, with the national emissions targets of the governments, the world governments, and they also project where we have to go with our emissions, and it's no surprise that emissions have to decline rapidly from 2020. They give the 2 degrees C and the 1.5 degrees C consistent emissions. This next one in line, I've had to record separately. This is the UNEP gap report. UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, issues a gap report every year. This is the last one, 2018. And the gap refers to how far off we are with the combined national emissions targets, how far off we are to climate safety. And of course, we're headed in exactly the wrong way to catastrophic planetary danger. Anyhow, we're looking at when emissions need to decline, and again, it's 2020, and that applies to both 2 degrees C by 2100, as is shown here, which nobody is going for now, of course, and the 1.5 degrees C target, which is a 2020 peak and decline with a very rapid decline, headed fast towards net zero by 2050. Or in this case, a little bit after 2050. This is a very interesting and I think very useful research paper, a team led by Johannes Rockström, and it's a paper for rapid decarbonization by the proposal of what they call the carbon law. And the carbon law is simply reducing emissions by 50% every decade, every subsequent decade. And the result is approximately the same as the IPCC's rate of decline of emissions, declining 50% from today by 2030. So this is CO2 emissions, again in gigatons per year, and again it comes to zero by 2050. This is a very authoritative and special assessment which was done by the United Nations Climate Secretariat in 2016, a follow-up to the Paris Agreement. And the Secretariat calculated, and it must have been one heck of a job, the aggregate of the updated INDCs, that's intended nationally determined contributions, which simply means voluntary national emissions targets. This is in CO2 equivalent per year up on the vertical, running from 2000 to 2030. The emissions targets had been arranged that they would run to 2030. So I have kept in the projection here, and as you see, the combined emissions targets keep emissions increasing, and by 2030 they have substantially increased, and they're still increasing at that. Now we have a 2 degree C, what they call least cost pathway here, and the 1.5 degree C pathway here. I've marked 2020 as usual, but this is 2015 again. The emissions peak here soon after 2015. They're in, and they should have been, in rapid decline by now. This P1 is a notation for the immediate mitigation scenario, which has a better than 66% likelihood of staying below 2 degrees C by 2100. So again, this will give the impression of really how terrible and dire our situation is. Clearly, we're overdue for a rapid decline in emissions, and 2020 is the absolute very latest that the world can wait for literally a chance at survival. This one here is from the International Energy Agency, and they produce regular reports that do involve emissions of fossil fuel energy related carbon dioxide. They do this in special reports as well as in the annual World Energy Outlook, and this is the Energy Outlook for 2016. IEA makes the point that there's still a long way from a pathway to energy sector decarbonization, and the current pledges fall far short of limiting to 2 degrees C. And this is the 2020 decline, and these are the current the IEA calls them the current pledges, and again substantial increase by mid-century 2050, going in exactly the wrong direction, suicidal direction rather than the direction of relative safety. Emissions decline again by 2020, and because this was only 2 degrees C, zero is soon after 2080 by 2100. This is Climate Interactive. This is a website and a number of projects under the climate experts group and checked by the climate experts, and this is their scoreboard. And this one was published in 2016 again. This is global greenhouse gas emissions. The vertical axis runs from 2000 all the way through to 2100. And the emissions decline in both of these scenarios of the Climate Interactive decline at 2020. This one, the estimated 2100 temperature is 1.8 degrees C, so this is the 2 degrees C one basically. And this one with the faster decline is the 1.5 degrees C. So we've known for a significant number of years the big difference between 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C, both in how much we've got time left, which is nothing, and how fast emissions have to decline, which is very rapidly. And thanks to the IPCC, we know the huge difference in disastrous impacts and planetary catastrophic impacts at 2 degrees C. This is a scientific research paper published in 2016 by Rogelli and colleagues. Greenhouse gas emissions, so CO2e, and I've simplified this obviously, just taken the mean lines. In all cases, the emissions decline by 2020, and this was for a 2 degrees C scenario, and the name of the paper was the Paris Agreement proposals would have to be improved considerably. That was something like the title of the paper and certainly the gist of it. So another research paper telling us the same thing. This one here is from The Economist. Again in 2016, The Economist says global greenhouse gas emissions forecasts in gigatons of CO2 equivalent for less than 2 degrees C and for less than 1.5 degrees C. And as you see, the same thing. 2020, in both cases, emissions have to decline. For the 1.5 degrees C, they have to decline considerably rapidly, more rapidly than the 2 degrees C, and they quite definitely can. This definitely can be done. And there is a lot of material in the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report explaining how it can be done, best ways to get emissions to decline, which is clearly a combination of immediately applied mitigated measures that the 1.5 degrees C report covers. We're going even further back in time now. This is 2013. This is from Ecofys, another group of expert consultants with consulting for the benefits of government and industry, and publishing so that the public can get the results. This is a global greenhouse gas emissions projection towards zero. It starts in 1990 and ends in 2060. I put the 2020 arrow here, and this is a 2012 arrow. 2015 is what I put here to note the difference. So in this case, back in 2013, this was for both 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C. They sort of combined this in this same range here. So for 1.5 degrees C, yes, emissions had to have been in decline by 2015. And a similar reduction to what IPCC calculated, a 30% reduction in a matter of a decade or so. Current policy projections, again, suicidal scenario of increasing global emissions. The explanation on this presentation was that this had a high probability of 2 degrees C pathway, but with a return to 1.5 degrees C by 2100, and it's what the scientists are now calling overshoot, and but getting emissions down fast, so that overshoot levels out and doesn't take us into catastrophic territory of above 1.5 degrees C, certainly not for very long. So the last one that I finished with is, in a sense, a bit of a curiosity, but it's very, very interesting. This is the very first IPCC assessment in 1990, and this is a projection of their best case scenario, which was scenario D. In scenario D, the experts, the scientists, anticipated a slow decline of emissions, in other words, from 1990, and then getting to 2020, you see, a more rapid decline in emissions up to 2060. So actually, this also says a rapid decline of emissions from 2020. Very interestingly, however, the temperature target on this best case scenario was 2 degrees C. That's a 2 degrees C. That's a 2 degrees C warming by 2100. And the result of this best case scenario way back in 1990. Emissions, of course, are way up here. Now, in 2020, emissions are up there. This clearly demonstrates the deplorable, terrible delaying and waste of time and tactics and strategies, basically to make sure, and it succeeded, to make sure that the fossil fuel industry remained dominant and countries in the world remain dependent on fossil fuels for energy. And we know all about the globally criminal campaign of deception and confusion that was started by the big global fossil fuel energy corporations. It was actually started in 1988-89 with the Global Warming Coalition, because at this time, in 1990, there was great public interest and support, strong support, for measures to avoid dangerous degrees of global warming by avoiding dangerous levels of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, which was the language in the subsequent 1992 UN Framework Climate Change Convention. The policies, the fundamental indispensable policies are included in the 1.5 degrees C assessment. They're totally obvious. They've been obvious for decades. They are the termination of fossil fuel subsidies, and in my view, those should be switched to elevate the amount of subsidies considerably to the renewable energy, or even more rapid development and distribution of survivable energy forms. And of course, as the IPCC 1.5 degrees report said, putting a price on carbon is indispensable. In conclusion then, looking at the big image with all the graphs, the messages from the science over the past 25 to 30 years, that has been researched over and over and communicated over and over. And I really don't understand how this most important aspect of the science and policy still is not out there. So I'm doing my best to get it out there. and I hope you'll help me in that endeavor. It is that, number one, global emissions of carbon dioxide and preferably the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, have to be put into decline rapidly and on an immediate basis. So our deadline is 2020. Emissions of carbon dioxide have to decline by 50% from today, from 2020, by 2030. That is doable. However, it requires at least the immediate termination of fossil fuel subsidies and the immediate charging by governments to charge a fee or a pollution fee or charge to, and full costed at that, to the large central polluters, who of course are the fossil fuel industry, who are continuing to avoid these greatest of all costs of their pollution. And the greatest cost at the moment, by far, is the air pollution, and then there's water pollution, and then, of course, there's atmospheric greenhouse gas pollution, a cost which will continue to increase even if we do put our emissions into decline, as we must by 2020. Not to terminate these subsidies, not to charge the fossil fuel corporations the full cost of their pollution, is an unprecedented, heinous crime of all time. Lastly, emissions have to continue to decline, and they have to be zero by 2050. Some of the scientific research papers you may have noticed said that total emissions have to be zero. Some, including the most recent IPCC 1.5 degree assessment, says that emissions have to be net zero by 2050. That can be further elaborated and determined once we have global emissions rapidly on the way to decline, starting next year, 2020. So thank you, and as I started, this is an appeal, so please do what you can to get this information out there. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple, it's pretty obvious. To do anything less is unthinkable, because to do anything less, we would be condemning today's children all around the world and all future generations to, as I say, really a life not worth living.